Okay, hello everybody. Nice to see so many people coming in. And welcome to this talk on revision and exam techniques. Before we start, I'd just like to say that every single one of us is an individual and we're all different in different ways. We accept quite happily the fact that somebody's got brown eyes, somebody's got blue eyes, somebody's got brown hair, somebody's got blonde hair, somebody like me has got grey hair. And we all have different brains as well. And our brains work in slightly different ways, possibly. I like my information in nice, tidy lists. My brain goes into panic mode if it sees a mind map. So that's the way I know my brain likes to work. My husband's got a completely different brain to me. He's artistic and musical, which I'm definitely not. And he works in a completely different way. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's quite important before we start for you to realize that I can't hand you a nicely wrapped package of revision techniques and examination techniques that's going to work exactly for everybody. What I'm hoping you'll take away from this evening are the ideas behind these. I've tried to give lots of examples, but you'll have to perhaps let yourselves or your pupils or your sons and daughters, whoever, you will have to let them develop the ideas that work for them. Okay, so one of the first things perhaps to consider, and this isn't going down right, isn't it? Oh. I'll just stop share and try again. It's just try clicking on it. Ah, there we are. It likes my mouse better than it likes my keyboard. How do they learn? And there are various ways. It might be one particular way. It might be a mix. Do they learn through what they see? Do they like to read information? And that's certainly my inclination. And if we look at this, this is a whole page of notes, and that's how I like my notes to appear. Not everybody's cup of tea by a long way. Some people like mind maps, and mind maps come in all sorts of shapes and sizes as well. There's a nice little simple one. There's something a little bit more complicated, which has got lots of colour in it. And then you've got a mind map like that, which works really well for some people, doesn't work at all for others. Some people might like to put things in coloured boxes, and they might like those boxes not nicely lined up like the previous slide, but dotted around all over the place. And you notice one of the advantages that somebody's taken up here with these boxes is that they've made them different sizes. The bigger the box, the more information probably that's in it, you see. So it gives them instantly an idea of how much there is in that particular section. Dotted around like that works for some people, not for others. My computer home screen has got about 30 icons on it, and they're all neatly lined up on the left-hand side of the screen in 3 straight lines. But I remember standing behind somebody else and looking at their screen, and they've got about 30 icons as well, and they were completely scattered all the way across the screen. That worked for them. It wouldn't work for me. So again, you know, you do need to see just what will work for the person concerned. Do they learn through what they hear? Would they prefer to listen to something to learn? Auditory learners, in fact. Now, that's a bit more difficult to demonstrate on this, but we will come back to it a little bit later. But it's the same idea, but you're learning through what you're hearing rather than what you're reading. And then there's the people who like hands-on learning, kinesthetic learners. And there are ways that they can work well. Post-it notes are good for people who like to actually be hands-on. You can get them in stationery shops, you can get them in WH Smith's, you can get them in different colours, you can get them in different sizes. And the thing about post-it notes is that you can get your headings or your notes on them, and then you can organise them afterwards. It doesn't matter, in fact, what order the thoughts come originally, you can then reorganise them. You might want to add a couple more. You can add different coloured post-it notes for different areas within a topic. So they're useful for people who like to actually do things when they're learning. And you can add the colours in between if you think that that's where they fit. One of the best ways probably is what we call multisensory learning, where you're listening, you're seeing it, and you're doing it at the same time. And we will look at a little bit of that a little bit later on. But it is worth having a little think before you start any revision about how you will best do that revision and how you will best learn from it. So some of those looked a little bit random, the scattered boxes, for instance, but I think no matter how you set it out and no matter how random it actually looks, it's actually quite important that there's some kind of method behind it. And this is something I feel is really important, because as you're going through the revision process, you need to be able to answer 3 questions, I think. What do I know really well? What do I know fairly well? And what don't I know? And that takes a certain amount of organisation. Speaking from long experience over a long teaching career about watching pupils revise, they tend to have a whole page of notes in front of them. And in order to revise, they get a fresh piece of paper and they try to reproduce all those notes. Now, there may be some parts of those notes that they're already very familiar with. There may be some parts of those notes that they've got a reasonable knowledge of, and there'll be bits of those notes that they perhaps don't know at all. But by rewriting the whole thing just as another page of notes, makes it quite difficult to sort out what they have got a good knowledge of and what they still need to do. So let's have a look at some of the ways in which you can organise your revision, because this leads to what you really need to know is, what have I still got to do? There's not an awful lot of point in going over and over something that you actually know quite well. What really matters is making sure you learn the bits that you still don't know. So how can you go about this? Well, let's go back to that page there. Now, I'm not a historian. This was put together with a pupil who was doing a fairly high-level history exam at some point, and if you're on a small screen, you probably won't be able to read it. It's actually the causes of the First World War, and it's set out. There are 6 headings. The first one is economic situation in Germany. The second one is the system of alliances in Europe. Number 3, personality of the Kaiser. Number 4, volatile situation in the Balkan states. Number 5, assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand of Sarajevo. And number 6, why was the war such a catastrophe? Now, that is the structure of that. I'm not responsible for these notes. As I say, I'm not a historian. This information was supplied to me, so I'm assuming it's reasonably accurate. There's an enlarged version of just the top of that, so that you can just see how it is. You've got your heading for the first one, and then you've got 4 subheadings there. The need to find markets for its industry, losing out in competition with empires of Britain and France. Britain had industrialized over a period of a century, and even then the social effects were bad enough. And Germany had industrialized over a period of 15 years, boom and bust. And this led to extreme poverty in the cities. So you've got quite a lot of information there. Within each of those, you're obviously going to have a lot more detail. So how are you going to learn this whole page of notes? Well, there's the original page. Now, you do want a sort of overall total of your notes, just like this, in fact. But when it comes to learning them, and with computers these days, you don't need to use lots and lots of sheets of paper. You can just keep using the computer screen, deleting it and starting again. Now, from that, I think the most important thing is to learn those basic bones of the notes, those 6 headings. So the next page you want is just a page with the heading Causes of the First World War and numbers 1 to 6 down the side. And what you need to do, I'll just go back to that for a moment. The first thing you need to check is, do I know those 6 main points that form the structure of the overall topic? So you've got your blank screen, piece of paper, or you've got your blank screen there. And all you need to do initially is just fill in those first 6 headings. It may be that you don't know them all, but when you do it like that, you'll know instantly which ones you knew and which ones you didn't know. Let's say you knew numbers 1 and 2. You weren't too sure about number 3. Number 4, yeah, was okay. Number 5, you couldn't remember. And number 6, you couldn't remember. So what you need to do is to make sure you go back to those particular numbers, relearn them quite thoroughly, and don't move on then until you've taken this page again, blank page, and you've written out those 6 headings again. And again, ideally, you want to make sure that you've got those absolutely firmly in your mind before you go on to the next stage. Now, when you've done that and you've got those 6 headings which form the skeleton, if you like, of the topic of your revision, there are really 2 ways you can go from there. You can either do the next one, the next section, which means you've got your 6 topics and you've got your printed page with those 6 topics on because you've learnt those, and then you've got space to put all the subheadings, which again you need to fill in. Now, there's quite a lot of work there for learning, and I think for most people it helps to learn in bits and pieces. So probably better to take one of those sections on its own and learn those 4 subheadings. Now, I slipped past one slide. I'm just going to go back to it. Those are the 6 topics overall. Now, just to demonstrate there, you know the first one, the economic situation in Germany. You know the second one, system of alliances in Europe. You know the third one, personality of the Kaiser. You can't remember what those states were. You can't remember that they were the Balkan states. You've got a gap in your knowledge. The 5th one, you can't remember at all. The 6th one, you know. So I'm hoping that that illustrates just how you can construct your revision so that you know what you know and you know what you don't know, which I think is really important. So let's go back to this. There's your sheet on the first topic, economic situation in Germany. And there are the 4 things you need to know within that. And there they are. You fill them in. You learn that. If necessary, you do that sheet again. Make sure you keep redoing these separate sheets until you really know them. And now you can only at this stage do you fill in the finer details under all those separate headings. And again, you might find it an awful lot easier to learn A completely with all its details before you go on to B again and learn those details. But the idea behind this is that you're always clear about which bits you know and which bits you don't know. And also, it's very structured. You're learning a little bit thoroughly before you learn any more. You're not trying to learn the whole thing. If you're just completely writing out a whole page of notes again, then it's a little bit too much to take in. And you're not, again, as I say, aware completely of just what you know and what you don't know. So that's one way you can do it. Now, and that will be the second page there. That's the second heading, you see, system of alliances in Europe. And I'm not running through the whole 6 pages because we won't have time for that. You can do the same thing with a mind map if you like mind maps. You've got the causes of the First World War. You've got your 6 points all the way around. Now, obviously, that's not quite as easy in that it's not in order. You might find yourself able to number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the same way. If you're left-handed, you might prefer to number them that way around. You might prefer to have colours instead. You might want to have numbers as well. You might not want to have numbers as well. Now, if someone prefers to have the colours like this, again, you've got to try and have a bit of structure behind it if you can. It's probably quite a good idea to try and have your colours in some kind of order. The first point, or the most important point, is always the red one. The next point is the green one, and so on. So that, again, you've got something that you're working your way through. You might be wanting to use the boxes. And again, as I say, with this one, you can make your boxes different sizes to it. You know that this one, for instance, has got far more to learn than this one, which has only got a couple of little points in it. And you can put your headings in the same way in these boxes and then fill in the details. The idea behind this is that you learn things a bit at a time, you learn them very thoroughly, and you're very clear about what you have mastered and what you still need to work on. Post-its in the same way for people who like to do things hands-on. You can use the same sort of thing there. Again, you can use your different colors. This is another possibility. Supposing, for instance, and as an English teacher, this is something that crops up in my mind, compare and contrast two poems. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which you can do this. There are various things that in that sort of area that you might need to consider: the subject matter of the two poems, the structure of the two poems, the vocabulary, the rhyme scheme, the imagery, and some poems will have even more things in. So how are you going to learn those? Well, if you sketch out something like this, what you've got there, you've got a starting point, as it were. You might decide you want to learn the subject matter of the first poem and the second poem at the same time. And then you might want to look at the rhyme scheme of both of them and so on. Or you might like to learn the subject matter of one and then the subject matter of another, the rhyme scheme of one and then the rhyme scheme of another. Or, and this has slipped onto another slide, you might like to learn everything about the whole poem before you learn anything about the second poem. Get that there as a structure, and then if you do it on a nice big piece of A4, or you get a nice big a document open on your screen, you can write your notes against these little arrows here. So that's another structured way in which you can organize your revision. And again, it will show you what you know and what you don't know. This is something from a long time ago. It's a template, and I've added it in, although in itself probably not something as a topic these days with exams now, but the idea behind it is perhaps worth looking at because it would have some uses. This was something set up for someone doing, again, fairly high-level chemistry, where they had to learn a lot of different experiments. And what we did is we set out a template for that. Now, probably like me, you haven't done chemistry for quite a while, or you may be a scientist anyway. But if you've got your experiment, you've got your apparatus, you need an equation for it. You might need a few notes. Now, you might be putting a solid and a liquid into that experiment, and you might heat it up. When you do that, you'll get a reaction, and you might get a solid, you might get a liquid, you might get a gas, you might get some heat coming out the other side. What matters with this is that you always use the same template for every single experiment, and then you've got this mental picture. Well, with that experiment, that box had something in it, that box had something in it, and that box had something in it, and that box and that box had something in it. Another experiment might have things in the different places, depending on what you put in and what you get out of that experiment, you know, what sort of reaction it gets. So because you've always got these in the same place, you can picture that. Some people have got a very good visual memory, and a box, they'll see that there's something in that box, in their memory, as it were, so they know that perhaps that there's a solid involved in that, and perhaps a liquid. And that maybe when they put those two into the apparatus and they apply some heat, maybe a gas is formed. So that's another idea when you've got to do lots of things that are very similar. You could perhaps use it again for poems or plays. You could make a structure of the plots on the characters, for instance. And if you always have these boxes in the same order, then it helps you remember what you need to know about these things. So that's another possibility. How can you turn this into auditory learning? Well, it's the same sort of idea, but you need to record things. Now, the very act of doing the recording like this will help you learn an awful lot, I can assure you. The very fact that you're having to organize it all and you're having to record it all will really begin the learning process. And what you'll have to do in cases like this is you will have to work it out quite carefully beforehand. But if we're using the same idea again, the causes of the First World War, you need to make yourself a recording. Now, again, you've got to learn those first 6 headings. So what you'll need to do when you're recording is say, number 1, let's the recording go on with no sound for a while to give yourself time when you're actually coming back with your answers to either say what that point is, the economic situation in Germany, or if you prefer to write it down. And then at the end of that little bit of silence, you need to record what that answer is, the economic situation in Germany. And then point 2, space on whatever it is you're recording on. And then the answer, system of alliances in Europe. Again, you're having to produce your answer and you've got your check straight away. It does take a lot of time to set up something like this, but on the other hand, once it's set up, it's there for using. And learn a little at a time and don't move on till you know that bit thoroughly is something I would want to stress, I think. Going back to the first idea, the learning about the causes of the First World War, learn those 6 main headings to start with, and don't move on until you can take that piece of paper, or you can look at your screen, and without really having to think about it, you can write down those 6 headings. Only then do you need to start thinking about those subheadings. So try and make sure that you don't move on until you've got that little bit very secure in your memory. Let's have a look at a few other areas. Spelling, generally speaking, isn't something that you're going to be spending a lot of time on. I mean, you know, this is obviously more of a primary school thing than secondary, but sometimes in some topics, and I'm thinking science, you know, biology, chemistry, it's sometimes quite important that you can spell those words properly. So there may be some quite difficult words, in fact, that you do need to learn how to spell. So let's just have a look at a good way of learning how to do that. Now, when children are learning to spell in primary school, you know, they get their work marked and the teacher will say, perhaps after a spelling test, oh, that word's not spelled correctly, try again. So the child looks at the letters and thinks, what other order can I put them in, and writes things in a different order, or perhaps puts a different letter in. That is just a way to confusion. So I always feel that when you're learning to spell a word, the most important thing is that every time you learn it, you actually spell it correctly. So if you've got, say, half a dozen scientific words that are really quite important to you, and you really do want to be able to spell them correctly, try doing this. Get some card, because card lasts longer than paper, and write the word on it. This is a word I use when I'm working with primary pupils, but it demonstrates it really well. So let's use these. So you write the word correctly on a piece of card, nicely spread out like that. S-E-P-A-R-A-T-E. Obviously, the words you'll be using will be much more complicated than that, probably. And then cut up another strip of card into pieces that fit perfectly there, and put each letter in turn on one of those cards. And then if you're right-handed, you just want to use your right hand. If you're left-handed, you just want to use your left hand. Don't go using both hands and passing letters across from one hand to the other, because that's a bit confusing again. And using that writing hand, pick up the first letter, look at it, say it, put it in place, and do that for all the other letters until you've got it. What you'll be doing there is you'll be seeing each letter in turn, you'll be mentally saying it to yourself, and you'll be physically lifting that letter and putting it in place. Very much a good example of multisensory learning. Obviously, you're not going to learn it first time necessarily. Go back, mix the letters up again, do it again. You might find that you need to do it, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times. But it's a really good way of getting spellings into your head. So if your subject does need precise spellings for certain words, that actually does work. I can guarantee you more or less that will help you to be able to learn to spell those words. What that says up there, hidden behind that little bar, is the set books. things like plays and novels and books of poetry for maybe English exams. You can get most of these books as audiobooks. You can get those probably through your local library. You might have to order them specially. You can get them in bookshops. And there's a couple of charities from where you can borrow audiobooks. There's Calibre Books. And there's another one called Listening Books. Worth bearing in mind, perhaps, that a lot of audiobooks are abridged. But they will nevertheless, for a novel, certainly, they will have the story there. It will be a really good way of revising. If you've got something like a Shakespeare play, it'll be absolutely complete. Get a really good DVD of all sorts of ways you can access these days. And just listen to it. Just sit there quietly listening to it. It could be really helpful, you'll find, for helping it to settle into your mind, as it were. It's no substitute for writing notes as well, but it's a good way of revising initially, perhaps. When it comes to maths, this is my second teaching subject, so I've got quite an interest in this as well. One of the problems I find sometimes is signs can be quite difficult for someone who has dyslexic type difficulties. You know, you've got signs like greater than and less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. Again, I think the best way to do this is to take a sign that you're not quite sure of, write it out carefully, quite large, and try and write a whole line of them across the page, just that one particular sign, and keep practicing that until you can say, right, less than or equal to, and you can just, without again having to particularly think about it, you can write a whole line of them. And something simple even, like fractions. Fractions written like this can be much more difficult to cope with than fractions written like that. Now, I have actually checked a fairly recent SQA maths paper, and they do use them like that. So that's absolutely great. But it's again, when you come to do the working yourself, bear in mind, you know, make things as easy as you can for yourself. Again, for maths, make sure you know the words. You take the word number, for instance. You've got whole numbers, you've got even numbers, you've got odd numbers, you've got prime numbers, positive numbers, negative numbers, square numbers, cube numbers, left the T out of rational numbers, irrational numbers, and you can even round a number. All sorts of things to learn and remember. And again, try and just do them one at a time. Learning one at a time and learning it thoroughly is a good way of moving ahead. Again, with maths, horizontal and vertical can be difficult and confusing with graphs and timetables, but don't be afraid to put arrows or just to put your ruler at the side of a timetable if the question's on a timetable, or maybe it's a horizontal timetable. You know, think of ways in which you can make things easier and more reliable for yourselves. Back when I was in school, and that's a long time ago, we used to talk about problems that we used to have to solve. Now, again, I've used a very, very simple one because it demonstrates it more clearly. Obviously, this is a much more simple question than you would get on a secondary maths paper, but it illustrates the point I'm trying to make. You might find that you've got somebody you can say to them, what's 2 times 35? And they'll tell you the answer is 70 without any great difficulty. But you wrap it up in words like this: I buy 2 packets of crisps costing 35 pence each. How much change do I get from the pound? And the whole thing becomes a lot more complicated for them. And when you're in a maths exam, you haven't always got time, you know, to worry too much about these things. So try and encourage them to illustrate it. It can really make a difference. So for instance, what have you got here? Well, you've got 2 packets of crisps. You don't have to be artistic to do this. You just A couple of circles will do. What do you know about those 2 packets of crisps? Well, they're 35p each. What do you need to do to that? You need to add it and you get an answer. What else do you have to do for that question? Well, you've got a pound coin, which is 100p, and you need to take away the cost of those crisps. And if you can turn those words into illustrations, it can make it a lot easier to work with. And don't forget that in an exam, you're under pressure anyway. So again, if you can put things in a way that your brain likes a lot better, it can help enormously. This touch typing is something I feel quite strongly about this. I put it in here. Obviously, exams aren't all that far away, and it's not something you're thinking about for the current lot of exams. But if you've got another set of exams next year, or you're off to university, I would seriously consider learning to touch type. That means that you practice, and there are some really good touch typing programs out there. You practice and practice using the same fingers for the same keys each time, to the point when your fingers will work automatically. Now, SQA exams are digitized these days, for example. If you've got used to the computer, then you can do that rather than a scribe, perhaps. Now, even learning to touch type is useful. It strengthens your brain-hand-eye coordination, which is always good. Gives you lots of spelling and reading practice while you're at it. But the real bonus of being able to touch type is that your brain is free to think about what it wants to say. If you're handwriting in an exam, or if you've got a computer and you're typing in the exam, part of your brain is focusing on doing that writing or doing that typing. If you've learned to touch type, then your fingers will work automatically and your brain will be free to completely think about what you're trying to say. And to give you an example of that, and again, it's history, which is not my subject, but it just happens to be the one example that I think perhaps illustrates this really well. This is going back to a pupil of mine many years ago. And he went off to university with a reading and spelling age of about 7 or 8. So, you know, he really did have some problems, but he enjoyed touch typing. He learnt actually quite quickly, and he became an expert at it. And when it came to his exams, one of his history papers, and it was a higher level paper, one paper was where the pupils were given documents that they hadn't seen before. The documents were typed out. We're not talking about, you know, sorting out old handwriting or anything like that. The documents were all typed out, but they were documents they'd never seen. They had to read the document and then they had to type up their answers or write them, as the case may be. Now, in his case, he'd got a computer, and it's a long time ago. It was a full-size monitor and a full-size computer. It wasn't a nice, tidy laptop. So we used to give him a desk in front of him with the computer on, and then we put another desk at a slight angle at the side of him, on which he had his question paper and rough paper if he needed it. And he was, as it happened, the only candidate for that paper who was using a computer. We got him in a separate room, and quite by chance, I put myself down to invigilate that exam. And I sat behind him, because with just the one candidate, it didn't really matter. I could keep an eye on him. So I sat behind him and I watched him. He got extra time. He read the first document through very carefully and he reread it. Then he read his questions for that. Then he went back to the passage and the first question, and I sat there watching him. His hands were typing, but his head was sideways, looking at that other desk with the question paper, the document and the questions on it. He didn't have to keep going backwards and forwards from what he was reading to the typing. His fingers carried on typing while he read the answer that he was needing. So, you know, his brain was completely free to think about what he was wanting to say for those answers. He didn't have to keep going back to look at his keyboard. So it's something I would definitely recommend. It takes a long time. You probably need to think about a year or so to learn, but very much worth it. I know this isn't exactly a revision technique or exam technique, but it can make a huge difference. He certainly said it changed his life for him. So We've got about 10 minutes left, so let's look at exams. Let's move on to this. And you've got exam nerves and panic. We all know those feelings, we've all faced them. And they can make a huge difference. I've been working with a pupil recently, just on a one-to-one basis, who more or less goes to pieces as soon as she walks into an exam room. And because of that, she doesn't necessarily do as well as she might. So what can you do about these exam nerves and panic? And I'm not talking about medication here, but you know, your mind is perhaps like this, all sorts of interference going on there, getting in the way of your clear thinking, all these panic flashes. Maybe beforehand you feel a bit sick, you're shaky, all sorts of things to get in the way. Now, I think what's really important here, it's absolutely normal to feel like this before and at the beginning of an exam. You might feel nervous, shaky, sick, panicky. Just accept that that is normal. That is the way you will feel. You know you feel like this in an exam. Just accept that that's how you are going to feel. It's when you start getting anxious and a bit panicky and you start panicking because you're panicking, that's when it all starts to escalate, and it can get quite difficult to settle down and work on an exam. So try, I know it's easy for me to say this, but try when you go into that exam, try and just accept, okay, my tummy's going to flutter, okay, my hand's going to shake a bit, and just accept that that is normal. Everybody feels like that before an exam. Some people don't always show it. Boys in particular tend to like to look cool, but they're probably feeling a little bit panicky as well, just like you are. Maybe it helps to chat to your friends about it beforehand. They may feel differently, you know, you might feel just a bit sick, they might feel a bit shaky. Just, you know, talk it through, accept it as normal. And as I say, it's easy for me to say, try not to worry about worrying. But if you can accept it, it will actually help. The other thing that, you know, is quite nice and can help as well, and I haven't put a slide about this in, but try and look beyond the exam. Try and picture something nice that's going to happen after the exam, even if it's just walking out the door with your friends, or maybe going to have a coffee. You will actually get to that stage. The exam will pass. I think this is perhaps one of the most important things about these exams. Just try and accept that these nerves do happen, and try not to let them get out of hand. Because it's when you worry about feeling panicky that it can escalate. Give yourself time to settle if you can. And this is something that I always stress, and we will do a little bit of work on this at the end if we've got time. Read those questions carefully, and we will be demonstrating that. A few ideas to help you through. Lots of exam papers, maths for example, they have space for answering on the question paper. So you don't have to start at question number 1, then do question number 2, then do question number 3 and work your way through. It may be that you look at the first question and you think, oh dear, I'm not sure how to do that. Well, okay, pass it, go on to the second one. Keep going on until you find a question you can do, you know you can do, and that you know you can get it right quite easily. Build up your confidence. If you don't like the look of it, just go on. And I put it like this, keep combing through that paper. If it's a paper where you answer on the paper, unless there's an absolute need to do them in order, and I can't think of any reason why there would be, just keep combing through that paper. You'll do all the ones you can do first, and you'll feel all that bit happier because you've done them. Then you'll do all the ones that you think, well, I ought to be able to do that. I'll have a go. And then at the end, you've got time left, you can have a go at the ones that you're not at all certain about. So that's one way of doing it if you're answering on the paper. If you've got essay type questions, go back to some of those ideas from the revision section to plan your answer. Remember learning the structure like this. It doesn't take long just to jot down those 6 headings perhaps before you start. You might want to quickly draw out a mind map. You might want to put your boxes there. you can't actually see it because of that black bar, but I put post-its there and I put a question mark after because I'm not sure that post-it notes would be allowed in an exam room. So that might not be something you can consider, but doesn't take long just to sketch out a little plan of the essay. Remember, we looked at different ways, and this is actually quite a complicated one, but again, it illustrates how quick and easy it is. If you start writing an essay straight away, you may get halfway down the first page and think, oh, blow, I could have done it better if I'd done it this way instead. It's always good to do some planning. This peculiar looking set of 3 lines, my husband's an art historian. And one of the questions his pupils had to deal with once was what's known as a triptych, this shape. It's a 3-piece painting behind an altar in a church, usually. Well, the question on it involved using all 3 of those pieces. And in the exam, it wouldn't have taken long to think, shall I do it like that? Shall I do it like that? Shall I do it like that? Or, you know, however you think you might be able to do it. And again, once you've decided on the picture, as it were, you can very quickly jot down a few notes. So, you know, make use of those ideas for planning an essay question. Sometimes it's better to move on. What do I mean by that? Well, for most questions, and whether they're short answer questions or whether they're longer questions, the early marks are often the easiest ones to pick up. So if you're running out of time at the end of the exam, and let's say you've got 2 questions left on that paper that you haven't had a chance to look at yet, you know you haven't got time to do them both completely, then it's often, not always, but often better to do a bit on each and pick up as many marks as quickly as you can on each of them than it is to do one of them completely and maybe get 3/4 of the marks because you're doing it in a bit of a rush anyway, or maybe you've left it till the end because you don't know it all that well, and then leave the other question completely undone where you simply won't pick up any marks. It may be something you have to use your judgment on as to whether you can quickly pick up some marks on each. If you can't do anything on the last question, then okay, you may be better spending your time on the one before, but have a think about it. It is something worth considering. Right, we've got a couple of minutes left, Lena. Can we just test them? Remember that slide that said, make sure you read the questions carefully. I hope you've all got pencil and paper because you need to jot down some answers here. I'm going to put some questions up. It's all about reading and understanding the question. If there are 5 apples on a plate and you take 3 away, how many apples do you have? Jot down your answer. If there are 5 apples on a plate and you take 3 away, how many apples do you have? And Lena's already looking worried. There's another one. A farmer has 16 sheep and all but 9 die. How many sheep has he got left? Farmer has 16 sheep and all but 9 die. How many sheep does he have left? And here's a nice one. Is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? Is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? Think about it. How many 2p stamps are there in a dozen? How many 2p stamps are there in a dozen stamps? There's another one which needs a bit of thought. James has 2 British coins which together add up to 55p. One is not a 50p piece. What are these 2 coins? James has 2 British coins which together add up to 55p. One is not a 50p piece. What are the coins? And finally, make one word out of the letters new door. You must use all the letters and you can only use each one once. Make one word out of the letters new door. You must use all the letters and you can only use each one once. Give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about that. then we'll look at some answers. And remember, it's all about reading the question carefully and knowing what the question is telling you and knowing what the question's asking you. Okay, shall we look at some answers? If there are 5 apples on a plate and you take 3 away, how many apples do you have? If you've answered 2, it's wrong. If there are 5 apples on a plate and you take 3 away, how many apples do you have? You've got 3 apples. It doesn't ask you how many apples are left on that plate. You take, yeah, I can hear some chuckles coming in the background. Okay, what about the second one? A farmer has 16 sheep and all but 9 die. How many sheep does he have left? Well, he has 9, all but 9 die. Remember the question? A farmer has 16 sheep and all but 9 die. How many sheep does he have left? There is no need to subtract. All but 9 die, so he has 9 sheep left. Again, make sure you read the question carefully. Is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? Lena's shaking. I can only see Lena. Lena's shaking her head.
My problem is, Mary, that I've been asked this question before and I still can't remember the answer.
You've been to my talks before, at least twice. And you've forgotten the answer. This is an example of making sure that you read the words carefully and you understand. I mean, it isn't a question that you would get in an exam. If you like, it's a bit of a trick question. But if a man, is it legal for a man to marry his widow's sister? If that man has got a widow, he's dead. He can't have a widow until he dies. His widow is the person that's left after his death. Make sure you understand the wording. As I say, that would be a, that wouldn't be a typical question, but it is a question that perhaps illustrates how important it is to make sure you've understood the wording in that question. How many 2-pence stamps are there in a dozen? Well, 12. Don't be misled by the fact that they're all 2-pence stamps. There aren't 6, there are still 12 in a dozen. James has 2 British coins, which together add up to 55 pence. One is not a 50-pence piece. What are the 2 coins? Do you remember this one, Lena? I wish I could see everybody and get the hands up as to what answers you've got, but there's too many people there and I can't see people anyway. Well, the answer is a 50-pence piece and a 5-pence piece. Only one is not a 50-pence piece. So there's no reason why one of them can't be. In fact, there's no other way out of 2 coins you can make 55 pence. One of them has got to be a 50 pence. So if you go back to the question, James has 2 British coins, which together add up to 55 pence. One is not a 50-pence piece, but only one of them isn't. Careful reading. And what about this last one? Make one word out of the letters new door. You must use all the letters and you can only use each one once. Lena? No?
Fail again. Oh, somebody's Kelly. Oh.
Go on, I can't see her.
Kelly is saying one word.
Yes. Make one word out of new door. O-N-E-W, whoops. Go back, sorry. O-N-E-W-O-R-D. The question tells you to make one word out of new door. Okay, it could be meaning to make a single word out of it. But again, the purpose behind this particular question is think quite carefully. What is the question asking you to do? It's easy to go down the wrong way. The very last examination I took at university, unfortunately, it wasn't my degree exams. It was the last exam of my postgraduate teacher training course, my 1-year teacher training course after I graduated. And I'd actually done education as part of my degree. So I was pretty familiar with it all and perhaps a bit overconfident. And we'd spent a lot of time on the development of a child from birth to the age of 5. And then we spent a lot less time on the development of a child from the age of 5 to, I don't know, the age of 10 or something like that. But they learned so much more between birth and 5 than they did afterwards. And the question came up on that final exam. I forget quite the wording of it, but it was asking about development of the child. And I thought, oh, great, I know all about this. And I didn't really look at it all that carefully. And I started off from birth. I wrote a page and a half before I sort of flexed my fingers, sat back for a moment and happened to look at the question again. And it wasn't from birth to 10, it was from 5 to 10. I'd wasted about 20 minutes writing a page and a half that simply wasn't on the question paper. Just hadn't read it properly, and you know. So I hope those will perhaps give you a feel for the fact of how easy it is not to read the question properly. So remember, bite-sized learning and be thorough. Learn one thing at a time, test yourself on that, then learn another thing, test yourself on that, and then test yourself on both. Learn another one, test that, test all 3, build it up carefully. Make sure that you're filling the gaps that you don't know as well. Very important to reassure yourself or your child or your pupils that it's absolutely normal to feel anxious and a bit panicky. Try not to worry about it. Help them to accept this. Remind them to read the questions carefully, and I hope you're all a little bit more aware. And above all, give them confidence in what they can achieve, because that is the thing that matters perhaps most of all. We're 5 minutes over, Lena. I'm sorry. Thank you for coming along, and that's useful.
Quite okay, thank you. If you want